For rapidly approaching a century, if not longer, the West has had an unbroken fascination with Eastern culture. And in a yin-yang type of fashion, the East have also been fascinated by the West. Their cultures have bounced off each other for decades, warping and twisting to suit different classes and sensibilities. Through the late 1950s and 60s, the Chinese and Japanese would both become absolutely infatuated with US culture, adopting their music, styles, food, and prudent Puritan values. Seriously, they covered so many genitals in those 2 decades. It's a problem still to this day. But for today's review, we need to start a little bit further back in time than the film we'll be talking about. From the early 1930s through to the 1960s, the US had slowly begun to embrace large production horror and science fiction. With the rise of the Universal monster movies setting the standard and paving the way for literally hundreds of new films, directors and writers would emerge over the following decade as a result of modern audiences wanting shock, suspense and thrills. In 1933, RKO would distribute King Kong, a film that would blow audiences away with its scale and special effects. Universal eventually managed to secure the rights to this film after its success, but it was quite clear. People wanted giant monster movies, grand-scale productions about tiny humans fighting giant versions of things. What followed was almost 3 decades of us versus them style horror suspense films, with highlights including Tarantula, 20 Million Miles to Earth, Gorgo, and The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms. Giant monster movies were very in the 50s, and over in Japan they were more than just popular, they were the entertainment, and they wanted a slice of the pie. Jump to 1954 and Toho, a production company who were about to release one of the studio's most popular creations, would release Godzilla, which would change the landscape of the giant monster movie almost overnight. And while I can't provide concrete evidence to say that it was influenced by the giant monster movies of the US, it would almost certainly seem to be the case. It mixes traditional Japanese folk stories with more modern horror movie elements to create a powerful piece of cinema that's arguably one of the best examples of the giant monster movie in action. Of course, with this kind of populist hit, the floodgates of the genre would inevitably open, and the Japanese giant monster movie genre more or less kicked into high gear very shortly after this film, with numerous Godzilla sequels, spin-offs, and even an epic showdown between the giant lizard and the great monkey himself, King Kong. The boom of the Japanese giant monster movie was the equivalent of a jumper cable on Western monster films, which by the mid to late 50s were just starting their steady decline. It increased their longevity by almost a decade further by influencing Western writers and filmmakers to think differently. In fact, large swathes of Japanese monster films were imported over to the US through the late 50s and 60s. How they were treated once they arrived here, however, was entirely down to luck. Some monster films would land in the right hands, and when it came to localizing and dubbing the film for English-speaking audiences, they'd largely remain intact, and the script would be reworked to make it more accessible. These success stories, however, are quite few and far between. And that brings us to today, in which we'll be looking at a film that some would consider one of the unlucky ones. 1966's Gammera the Invincible, also known as Gammera the Giant Monster, originally known as Daikaiju Gammera, was a film that was acquired by Sandy Howard and Richard Kraft for localization. Now, here's where things go a bit off the rails.
Take cover! Gammera is attacking! Come on, we've got to stop them! Take cover! No! None of this, quick! Gammera! He's coming, I tell you! Quickly! Hurry, get out of here! Quickly, move! Go on!
Blow your cool. We're not going anywhere. Right. I say we should stay here and dance. How about it? Yeah.
The original Japanese Gammera isn't the greatest film ever made, but it's consistent and delivers on what it promises. You want a giant turtle destroying Japan? You got a giant turtle destroying Japan. Sandy Howard took Daikaiju Gammera and renamed it Gammera the Invincible. He also took the footage from the original Japanese version and added an extra 10 to 15 minutes specially shot in the US to help get more Americans on board to see the film. Richard Kraft, I believe, helped translate and localise the script. Both of these elements have deep flaws. For starters, the additional footage adds absolutely nothing to the original film, other than frankly dull exposition. This was an already existing problem in the original Japanese version, and in the localised version, this exposition only exacerbates the situation. None of the extra footage matters. You could literally chop all of it out and it wouldn't make a difference. In fact, over the years, the film has been recut multiple times by multiple different companies, and some versions of the film do just localise the dialogue and nothing else. Speaking of which, the localisation of the dialogue in this film's a little bit too literal. The idea of translating a script like this would be leaving enough of the original script in place that it still tells the same story and still has the same emotional meanings, whilst changing enough of the dialogue to allow it to be as fluid and naturalistic as it can be when spoken by non-Japanese actors. The results here aren't terrible on the dialogue front, but there are occasions where they're jerky, a little bit too literal, and often have bits that sound very clunky and non-human-like. So apart from poor to middling localisation, what on earth is Gammera actually about? And is it any good? Well, Gammera follows a group of research scientists on an expedition to the Arctic, when a couple of planes, possibly containing spies, I don't believe it's ever actually made clear who they are, begin flying dangerously close to their research vessel. They retaliate and one of the planes is shot down. It turns out, however, that that plane had a nuclear bomb on board, and the resulting nuclear explosion thaws the ice and resurrects the great kaiju turtle Gammera, who immediately destroys the research vessel before disappearing in the direction of Japan. The research team managed to get away from the Arctic, but a strange UFO-shaped object begins to appear in the skies over several different countries. The US government decide to call an urgent meeting on how best to handle the situation, and decide to work with the Japanese and the Russians to help identify what Gammera is and how he can be stopped. There's also a subplot about a young boy who's fascinated with turtles, who develops a kind of, sort of, not really relationship with Gammera after it saves him from almost falling to his death. This all builds to a giant confrontation where we find out Gammera isn't just your average turtle, and a show-stopping finale takes place in Japan. While the Japanese version of this film is a little bloated in places, it's manageable. The US version of this film, however, is practically a balloon. It's literally slow-moving, reshot padded scene over slow-moving, reshot padded scene, occasionally broken up by the odd really cool fight sequence, or an original slow-moving padded scene. Fumi Takahashi wrote the original script for this film, and for the time it worked pretty well. By modern standards, it's almost sedentary. This film operates very heavily on a cheap and cheerful standard. Everything looks like it's made out of cardboard and old model kits. The cityscapes look unbelievable, the airplanes and some of the vehicle shots are literally just toy cars and planes. Even the full-suited Gammera looks a bit cheap. Though I must give it some credit, the close-up Gammera head does look quite impressive, in some parts. They give it lit-up moving eyes, and while it still has a Muppety quality about it, for the 1960s it's really not a bad effect. Most of the other effects are often achieved via careful lighting or matte paintings, which do the job to a point, though there are some scenes that do end up looking a little bit like very early Doctor Who soundstage shots, and that's not a compliment. Only adding to the cheap and cheerful nature of the film are the additional US shots, which look for the most part like a Poundland Doctor Strangelove. There are one or two scenes I'm almost certain are shot backed by chipboard, and these extra scenes have almost no sense of composition. It really just feels like a load of blokes sat around having a chat, rather than the military discussing how to treat a major incident. The direction for this production isn't too bad for this kind of thing, but one of the points that does bother me is that they really don't give Gammera any kind of menacing scale. His size is all over the place throughout the film, and they never really make it feel grand. They always shoot it from far away and very rarely, if ever, use low-angle shots, so it just looks like a guy in a suit for the most part. The editing for this film as well is heavy-handed to say the least. Most of the Japanese cuts are fine, but the extra footage is spliced in so haphazardly there are abrupt scene cuts and even the odd frame left in where cuts haven't been precise. The whole thing really isn't assembled very well. It feels rushed and in real need of some TLC. Gammera the Invincible has been released in multiple cuts on multiple films in multiple languages over the decades, and whether there's a definitive cut or not is debatable. The version I watched was released as part of the Sci-Fi Classics 50 movie pack by Mill Creek Entertainment, who frankly compounded the already precarious film by presenting it in one of the worst qualities I've ever seen. The print's scratched, dusty, in parts of the night footage it's hazy and blurry, almost to the point of being unwatchable. There are noticeable film breaks in parts, burns in the film, and to add insult to injury, not only is this just a VHS print copied onto a DVD, it's been heavily cropped. And to compensate, they've just used digital moves to get around actors being cut out of the shots. This means that the film will wildly swing from left to right if the cast are talking in a wide shot, and it has the knock-on effect of meaning I literally can't talk about the cinematography of this film, because I'd be being disingenuous. It's so far removed and has been tweaked so much from the original Japanese source material that I honestly can't tell you if it's good or bad without seeing a version of the film that hasn't been so screwed up. Luckily in the US they've released 2 Gammera box sets comprising roughly 8 films from throughout the franchise's history, including a heavily cleaned up version of this one, so you may have significantly better luck with those than I did. I will say that Gammera the Invincible does have one thing working for it, and that's the ending of the film. Those final 10 minutes come close to making up for the initial 75 or so that precede it. It's really good, but it's all too little too late. This is a goofy and in places charming production, but its ridiculous amounts of exposition and padding pretty much kill any pacing or energy this film could muster. Probably best enjoyed Rift, this is not an essential watch, but if you can hunt down the original version, and it's in good quality, you'll probably enjoy it, at least more than I did.